the Legal Corner podcast series. Welcome to today's episode of The Legal Corner, a podcast which covers a variety of legal issues to keep you informed. Hosted by attorney at law Colin Dinoon and communications specialist Leonardo Torres.
Adil Professor in the School of Business and Aviation, Algoma University, Ontario, Canada, and Managing Director of Aero Plus Logistics Corporation Canada, Freight Forwarding and Logistics Consulting. Right, so this is someone who is very versed in areas of law such as airline operations, business management, aviation training, logistics, and international trade. And his legal career transition leverages his work and business experience and education spanning over 2 decades in the Caribbean, United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. So, good day to you, Adil, and welcome to the Legal Corner podcast series.
Good day, Colin, and it's a pleasure having me on the podcast. This is not something I do regularly. Most of my of the interrelationship between law and aviation comes in my academic the academic hat that I wear, which is basically that of a professor with Algoma University in Canada. All right, so like I said, it's a pleasure having me, and I guess we can jump into the meat of the discussion.
Great, Adil, lovely to have you. Let's get into it. Tell us what legislation governs aviation in Trinidad and Tobago.
Well, that question is a heavily nuanced one. It's large. If you look at the legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, which is primarily the Civil Aviation Act number 11 of 2001 as amended, it's over 2,000 pages, right? And that includes the subsidiary regulations which govern the conduct of civil aviation. And I want to probably state for the listeners who may or may not be heavily into the business of aviation, that aviation itself is divided into 2 main headings. You have civil aviation, which is any aviation that is non-military or non-defense related, and of course you have military aviation. Trinidad and Tobago, being a small jurisdiction, which theoretically doesn't cover an expansive area of land and water, right? We do not have an air force. We post-independence, when the Constitution allowed the creation of the Coast Guard, at that point there was an extension to the Coast Guard called the Air Wing, which later transformed into the Air Guard, which is based, unsurprisingly, at the Piarco Airport. Right, and that is as much as we would have here in our system insofar military aviation, and interestingly, many of the pilots and flying positions at the Air Guard are actually open to civilian pilots. All right, so I just want to highlight that distinction between military aviation and civil aviation. Now, within civil aviation, you have commercial civil aviation, which is what we would see as our national carrier, Caribbean Airlines. That's the flag carrier of Trinidad and Tobago, and some of the other CARICOM nations, such as Jamaica. And we also have general aviation, which is any aviation that is theoretically non-commercial. So it will cover things like flight training, sightseeing tours. Years ago, the oil company would have aerial pipeline inspections, also crop dusting in the now defunct Caroni Limited, right? So all of that would have encompassed general aviation. But both general and commercial fall under the remit of civil aviation, right? Now, as I mentioned, the Civil Aviation Act number 11 of 2001 as amended, that is where we have the bulk of legislation that governs civil aviation in Trinidad and Tobago, right? It is not the only one. And how did this come into being? There is an organization called the International Civil Aviation Organization, right, which is actually an organ of the United Nations headquartered in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And that organization came into being in the year 1944, whilst World War II was still in its final stages, at a conference called the Chicago Conference. And there were 2 specific goals. The first was the establishment of international standards of airworthiness, flight training, crew certification, aeronautical communications, and radio aids to navigation. All right, that was one aspect. The other aspect was defining the principles and procedures for the economic regulation of aviation. Remember, this was in the pre-jet era when nations were opening their borders to air commerce for the transportation of mail. Actually, it started with mail and then it went to passengers. And of course, the United States was a heavy player in this, being the birthplace of aviation. And to date has the largest number of airfields of any country in the world. Right. Interestingly, Canada was selected as the chair of the ICAO, and it still is. So ICAO, right, having established these technical airworthiness standards for flight, standards for aerodromes, which is the technical name for a certified airport, right, would have been joined by various countries. And in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we became a member around the time of us becoming independent in our own right. Right. Now, of course, ICAO would promulgate various standards and recommended practices, which are contained in their documentation. And of course, apart from the standards and recommended practices, they have a number of annexes, which encompass everything from accident investigation to aerodrome certification, pilot licensing, radio navigation. It's an extensive volume, right, which countries would now incorporate into domestic legislation, similar to how a treaty operates in force. Right now, prior to 2001, the responsibility for civil aviation fell under the line ministry of the Ministry of Works and Transport. But the Trinidad and Tobago had certain obligations, international obligations under ICAO, which could have best been managed in the domestic capacity through an authority. And the Civil Aviation Act is what established the Civil Aviation Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. And that's, we could talk more about that afterwards. But to go back to the question of legislation, there's...
Mention the Civil Aviation Authority, Adil, because that leads me right into my next question as to what is the role of the Civil Aviation Authority?
Correct. I could address that, but I still want to return to other pieces of legislation. But let me touch on the Civil Aviation Authority first, right? Now, I should mention that the Civil Aviation Authority, right, is basically the organization that plays the crucial role of civil aviation in Trinidad and Tobago, which could be broken down into four, what I would describe as four functions. The first one is the regulation of civil aviation operations, right, within Trinidad and Tobago, as well as regarding Trinidad and Tobago aircraft, wherever those aircraft may be operated, right? Some common things, for example, certification of airmen. And the term airmen is an old one. It's not meant to be a gender term, but airmen refers to both men and women, pilots, air traffic controllers. In the old days, we had flight engineers, mechanics. Those are the main people that would fall under that level of regulation. So they cover the testing, recurrency, training recurrency, medical requirements, because pilots operate in dynamic environments. We have to maintain rigorous medical standards, right? So they're actually civil doctors in Trinidad who are authorized by the Civil Aviation Authority to overlook the medical certifications of pilots and ATCs, air traffic controllers. The other main function is providing air traffic services within what we call the PIACO Flight Information Region and other areas as defined by international agreements. It would come as a surprise to many people that if you were to see a map of the area that PIACO air traffic control is responsible for managing, it extends in the north to New York. So flights coming from North America would transition into New York's Flight Information Region and then PIACO, right? On the northwest, we have the San Juan Flight Information Region, which is Puerto Rico. Then we have Venezuela. Venezuela is Maiquitia. Then we have Georgetown, Paramaribo, which is Suriname. We have an area controlled by French Guiana in the south. And then this, again, another surprise. On the eastern boundary, we have Santa Maria, which I think is the Azores, and Dakar, which is Senegal in Africa. So our region goes all the way out into the mid-Atlantic. In fact, it's probably even closer to the continent of Africa, right? But that would be what we call upper airspace control. On the lower levels, we do control a significant area of the Windward Islands and Lesser Antilles, right? What we call en route traffic up the islands, right? We control all of those things, as well as the aerodrome control zones around PIACO and Crown Point, right? Which is now called Robinson International Airport. Then we also have other functions which fall within the remit of Trinidad's agreement under ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization. And one of those is aircraft accident and investigation. So any accident that occurs regarding a Trinidad and Tobago aircraft or Trinidad and Tobago crew anywhere in the world, by ICAO agreements, the Civil Aviation Authority has specialized investigators who would be part of the team conducting that investigation. And I think there was the last accident we had involving a Trinidad commercial aircraft was in Georgetown. I think the year was 2011. And since it involved a Caribbean Airlines aircraft, the Trinidad and Tobago Civil Aviation Authority would have had investigators on the ground in Guyana, although Guyana is its own sovereign space. And lastly, I think the development of civil aviation and maintaining an aviation system consistent with national security policy, that's also a goal of the Civil Aviation Authority. We have, for example, the introduction of drones in the last few years. Civil drones are regulated, right? There are rules that have to be followed, in addition to the telecommunication rules, because these are radio-operated devices, right? And the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago has an input into that. But if you allow me to just circle back to the other legislation, I'll mention briefly. We have the Civil Aviation Tokyo Convention Act of 1978 and 1985, which basically deals with offenses related to acts on board an aircraft. It gives the pilot in command, who is the captain of the aircraft, certain authorities in the case of people who are acting suspicious on board an aircraft or want to unlawfully control the aircraft. We also have the Hijacking Act of 1978, amended in 1985, which relates to the unlawful use of force or threats of any kind aboard an aircraft, right? Whether within Trinidad or internationally where a Trinidad aircraft may be operating. And this act actually came out of a Cubana, an incident involving a hijacking of a Cubana aircraft that departed Barbados in the late 70s. And interesting to most,
I'm familiar with that occurrence. I heard about
you're
that.
familiar with that, and you know what's most important, and it's actually a case study at the Airports Authority Security Awareness Training, which is mandatory for anyone who works at the airport. It is cited as an example of the interference of civil aviation, and the example here is that the explosive device, which would have caused that Cubana the downing of the Cubana flight, actually originated in Trinidad, right? Back in those days, they were lax, or I guess at that point, they didn't understand the impact that explosives and threats to civil aviation could have, right? And of course, the 60s and 70s were ripe for acts of unlawful interference, hijackings. I was watching a movie the other day on Netflix, and I can't remember the staggering figure, but there were many hijackings in 1 year in the 1970s alone. All right, so our legislation would have fallen in line with international standards and best practices. And of course, we also have the Airports Authority Act of 1979, which was proclaimed on the 4th of February 1980, one day before I was born. And this relates to the establishment of airports in Trinidad, right, and Tobago. And finally, in terms of legislation, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2005 and 2014, which relate to acts of criminal activity in general, but specifically the Anti-Terrorism Act speaks about specific powers given to the Chief Immigration Officer in relation to information supplied by other states in terms of the advanced passenger information. So all airlines operating into and out of any country these days, can't speak for all the countries, but all the countries that are within the ICAO system, have to report advanced passenger information before a flight. And the powers are given to the Chief Immigration Officer to intercept people who could present a threat to civil aviation. So that's an interesting fact that I think would benefit the general public.
Right, that's very interesting, Adil. I like the way that you gave us a broad overview of all of the relevant legislation that govern aviation in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, we all are familiar with the concept of an airspace, right? Because even if it's just from movies or what have you, we have all heard that term before. So tell us, how is a country's airspace determined?
Well, it's largely based on historical trends and developments, right? Now, ICAO would, of course, formalize international civil aviation Civil Aviation Organization would have formalized the boundaries and definitions. But let's think in terms of navigable airspace that is within the control of the Civil Aviation Authority, right? Now, any airspace above the minimum altitude of flight, and typically minimum altitudes vary depending on the nature of the operations. Around the airport, the minimum altitude is, if you're doing a training flight, it's usually 1,000 feet. In Trinidad, the minimum safe altitude is 4,100 feet, simply because the highest point in Trinidad is Aripo, which is 3,100 feet. So adding 1,000 to that, that's what we call the transition altitude of 4,100 feet. Now, you have two types of airspace, broadly speaking, controlled and uncontrolled. Uncontrolled airspace is what we typically class as Class G, right? And I should make a reference here to the Civil Aviation Act and the Air Navigation Services Regulations, right? Now, in Trinidad and in most countries that I'm a licensed pilot in Trinidad, United States, and Canada. And we all have the same broad classes, A through G. Class G, let me start at the last one because that's uncontrolled. It means that you can operate a drone subject to the other regulations. You can operate a drone in that class of airspace without having to communicate with the air traffic controllers at Piaco or Crown Point, right? Class A, to go back to the top now, Class A refers to airspace that is of the highest level in terms of control. It means flights operating there have to operate on instrument flight rules. And what instrument flight rules simply are specific guidelines, certification requirements for the pilots, equipment requirements for the aircraft, and certain checks that have to be done to ensure that aircraft maintain safe separation. You would hear that term a lot with air traffic controllers, separation. It's all about how to utilize the airspace optimally. Unluckily for us, or maybe unlucky, we don't have that much that volume of traffic in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, back in the day when I was flight training, anytime a few commercial flights come into the circuit at Piaco, the air traffic controllers would get a little more anxious once there were training flights and commercial flights operating in the same environment. And of course, our safety record goes to show we haven't had any, to my knowledge, we have never had a major in-flight collision here in our domestic airspace. There would have been general aviation accidents involving light aircraft, but nothing of the magnitude that you see in other countries. So control of the airspace is important. And you have the classes A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Piaco and Crown Point, if I'm not mistaken, they are both Class D airspace areas. And Class D airports are low-frequency airports, right? There is a concentric circle system. If you conceptualize it in terms of concentric circles, you start at the airport, and then you go out in terms of a certain radius, and then you go out. And once you go beyond that, the airspace areas around Trinidad and Tobago more or less are reflective of the maritime boundaries of 12 nautical miles, right? Because of our proximity to Venezuela, there is a slight modification in the southwestern tip over Cedras, right? But otherwise, it follows the 12 nautical mile range, which is the economic area of Trinidad and Tobago, the economic area of control, right? So to just backtrack a little bit to the airspace question. Every country has national sovereignty, right? And of course, has the ability to defend that airspace. In terms of Trinidad and Tobago, we also have to keep in mind that airspace that might be legal to enter for one aircraft may not be legal by another. And this came to the fore when drones became popular here. And of course, there may have been instances of private drones entering the vicinity of Piaco, and of course, those were dealt with. Right, so as a rule, you cannot operate drones in those areas, and I think that is of relevance to the common person who may be interested in owning a drone. Keep in mind that the airspace over Trinidad and Tobago is called a control zone up to the level of 5,500 feet, and further than that, there's the Piaco approach sector, which covers from the surface to 15,500 feet around Trinidad and Tobago. Beyond that, we have interfacing with Maurice Bishop, we have interfacing with Guyana, Venezuela, and so forth, right? So to answer the crux of the question, how is it determined? Geographical boundaries, right? For example, our interface with Venezuela is kind of irregular because of the proximity. And that's similar to many countries like the US and Canada that share a land border. right? Their airspace is determined by physical borders. I hope that answers that question simply without going into too much technical detail.
Yes. Tell us now, what would be the consequence of an unauthorized entry into a country's airspace?
Well, first of all, let's look at unlawful. Let me think about that question in terms of unlawful entry by what would otherwise be a lawful operator, right? Now, remember I mentioned there are two types of flight operations. You have instrument. Well, actually, I mentioned instrument, but I didn't mention the other one, which is visual. So you have two types of rules that aircraft operate under, visual and instrument. Instrument rules technically allow for aircraft to operate in complete darkness or bad weather. Visual means visual. The pilot has to maintain visual reference with the land, with the airport, etc. So let's say you have a visual pilot who is operating an aircraft that is not equipped for instrument, or he is not current or certified for instrument, and he goes and enters into any class of airspace that is controlled, but the weather is bad. The weather minimums, meaning the visibility is less than 3 miles, the cloud deck is lower than 1,500 feet. Then what happens is he becomes an illegal operator, right? And if he's a pilot, he could face sanction from the Civil Aviation Authority. More likely than not, air traffic control will tell him to call the tower and they'll bring him down. If it's someone operating a drone, then Civil Aviation Authority has the jurisdiction to do what is necessary to recover that drone, even if it involves engaging the police, right? Now, again, at the start of the discussion, I mentioned the Air Guard. Our Air Guard is not an air force. So if we do have aircraft coming into our territory that are unauthorized, be they of a military nature or even civilian, our ability to dispatch fighter jets and those things are basically it's non-existent, right? But what we rely on is a system of civil aviation identification of the aircraft before the aircraft actually come into our airspace. And our airspace, again, we're thinking about the airspace around Trinidad and Tobago, but we're also thinking in terms of the wider airspace that is managed by the PIACO flight information, that is defined by the PIACO flight information region, which goes all the way to Africa, borders with New York area, San Juan, Venezuela, and South American countries. And what we use is something called Mode C transponder systems, right? So the aircraft has a Mode C transponder, which is a radio that emits a signal. And that signal has the altitude encoding of the aircraft. It has the registration of the aircraft. So from the registration, we can tell the nationality. And the equipment that PIACO Air Traffic Control has in PIACO has the ability to decipher that and to tell whether an aircraft should be where it should be. At that point, they can engage in national security, the arms of national security, Minister of National Security himself, the head of the National Security Council, and also the Air Guard, right? Because it becomes a defense issue if an aircraft is entering from abroad that could have hostile intent. Lucky for us, we haven't had any issues with our South American counterparts in the air, as far as I'm aware. And most of the traffic that's coming from New York and Dakar and these places are airliners. And airliners are civil airliners. We have not had an incident of air piracy in Trinidad airspace for quite a long time, right? Does that address your question as to what could happen? Or do you also want to consider the consequences? Because it is clearly stated in our legislation, in the Anti-Terrorism Act, in the Civil Aviation Act, if there's an errant operator, that operator could be charged under the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, right? The Civil Aviation Authority has the authority to direct an aircraft to land where it is operating contrary to the established rules.
Lovely. At this point, we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. Adil, before the break, you were just talking to us about the consequences of breaching the airspace of a country. And I want to switch gears a bit now I want you to tell us what type of legal disputes usually arise within the aviation industry.
Yeah, most definitely, Colin. So legal disputes could come from any number of different areas, right? What I will do is let me focus on the most important ones in our jurisdiction. I think employment and labor disputes rank the highest here, simply because our industrial relations climate is much more vibrant compared to some other countries. And I would also say that our airline pilots are organized. They are a form of organized labor. And what you would observe, particularly not only with pilots but with other crew, is they operate under different types of situations. Their circumstances are shift. Most of them are shift workers. They face unique threats and hazards that you don't find anywhere else. Think about pilots and flight attendants. They operate at altitudes that are the average person does not work in an environment like that. They are subjected to higher levels of ultraviolet radiation from the sun, certain physiological effects and psychological consequences related to fatigue, which the average person may not face, right? So there have been several cases, more so when the previous BWIA was in existence. I was much younger back then, but I could remember many industrial relations type of issues would have arisen. So you would typically have disputes related to employment rights, contracts, those are the most common ones in the industrial court. And they do play a significant role because they have the ability to affect flight schedules. And of course, I think up to last year, Caribbean Airlines had a situation like that, which could have upended their flying schedule at a very peak period. So the courts typically try to ensure due process and equity in accordance with the Industrial Relations Act, and there's our industrial relations system is quite robust, as you know. The second area would be regulatory compliance. Airlines and aviation companies, such as maintenance operators, for example, must adhere to strict regulations. In the airline industry, things that we take for granted in everyday life, we cannot, because you don't want to have a commercial flight take off and encounter an emergency in the air because of shoddy maintenance. The history is rife with cases like that, right? Where planes took off with incorrect fuel, incorrect volume of fuel, and was forced to make emergency landings. We don't want to take chances with those things when you're flying over water, right? And of course, we are surrounded by water. So regulatory compliance is important. There's also the traditional tortious area, tort law, right? Insofar negligence, accidents, incidents. And there's one that I was recently invited to a book launch, right? And this particular matter resonates internationally. The name of the case is Tejro Bihari and BWIA International Airways Limited. It is groundbreaking in that it establishes precedents for operations of an aviation character. And in the decision of the Honorable Court, this accident occurred in 1994. A flight engineer, right, acting out of professional prudence, went to look at the hydraulic system on the L-1011 TriStar aircraft, as it then was, right? That was the main aircraft for BWI back in the day, the wide-body tri-engine aircraft. And when he went under the aircraft in the bay where the hydraulic equipment some of the hydraulic equipment was located, right? A stream of hydraulic fluid shot into his eyes. Shortly after, he lost his medical certification because his vision was impaired. And this matter took almost 3 decades to resolve, right? And there's a book available on Amazon, Grounded One Eye Open. That's recommended reading. And like I said, it's groundbreaking in terms of aviation accidents in Trinidad and Tobago because we don't have many of them, right? There were others in the past with coffee pots injuring flight attendants during flight. And those would typically fall within the standard realm of tort law, negligence, foreseeability, and damages calculations, right? But keep in mind, for a pilot or an air traffic controller who has to maintain a particular class of medical to maintain their license, anything that hampers that medical certificate would affect their earnings capacity. And insofar the calculation of damages, it requires its own body of consideration when arriving at an award for damages. Then, of course, we have commercial transactions, buying and selling aircraft, disputes over aircraft purchases, lease. They have different types of leases, wet leases, which would include a crew dry leases, which do not service agreements, other contractual obligations, including with ground operators that, for example, baggage handlers are contracted services. And most importantly, the COVID-19 recovery. We do not have too much of that here in Trinidad, but I know, for example, in Canada, I used to work in the Canadian airline industry for a while. When the Prime Minister of Canada ordered at the onset of COVID that flights had to be grounded, only essential and cargo flights were basically operating. And many airlines ran into financial problems, right? They obviously, no revenue or curtailed revenue would have affected their ability to pay their suppliers. And there are quite a few cases that came out of North America and the UK, which could be precedent should a similar thing happen in the future in terms of a pandemic, which could be precedent in Trinidad and Tobago law because we follow the common law system, as you know, right? But basically, that's the extent of it. Recently, I was involved in an aircraft sale of a private aircraft sale agreement, and they don't occur here with much frequency. Hence, lawyers such as myself who are influenced to practice aviation law, it's only a small area of our practice because we are simply a small aviation economy. We have a small aviation economy in Trinidad.
Right. Great. Adil, tell us, how has the pandemic affected aviation?
Well, the pandemic has affected aviation in profound ways. I mentioned a few moments ago that I was working in the industry, and I made the switch into law full time because of that, because I was laid off for 18 months from the aviation industry in Canada. Aviation is inherently international, right? And Trinidad and Tobago is no exception to that point. Most of all of our flights, commercial flights, are international. With the exception of Trinidad and Tobago, that's considered domestic. And during the COVID period, I believe those were the only flights that were allowed, other than emergency repatriation flights. And I can tell you, when the order was made, the health orders were made to basically seal our borders. I was abroad at the time in England, and I could have traveled between England and Canada without issue, except for a brief period when there were restrictions placed on flights between those two countries. But Trinidad and Tobago basically had a locked border. And the rights of many citizens, in my opinion, were usurped because you cannot restrict a citizen from entering Trinidad and Tobago, right? It is in the Citizenship Act. But granted, there were concerns over the spread of the virus, which was then still being studied, and the impact of the vaccinations and all those things were being studied. I think that should another pandemic occur, all countries and the private sector would be in a better position to mitigate this time, right? Remember, this was a novel situation. In terms of the wider effect that COVID had, decreased passenger traffic was foremost. I think we are now back to where we were pre-COVID. I haven't looked at the stats in a little while, but travel has rebounded. The issue is, if you compare the cost of travel pre-pandemic with the cost of travel now, it is probably 30 to 50% higher. And what many economists and people who are in the airlines themselves are saying, this has been done to basically repay the debt load that airlines and aviation companies would have been encumbered by as a result of the lost demand of COVID, right? And that's no surprise in any business. Airlines would also have had to make operational adjustments. Their capacity, health and safety protocols, all of these things would have been increased. Remember, in commercial air transportation, we have people from many different countries interacting with each other. Certain protocols regarding sanitization of the aircraft, all those things, even the type of air conditioning in aircraft, right? Using the high efficiency performance filters. Those methods would have been introduced in COVID, and hopefully they are here to stay. The policy responses, right? Particularly regarding the government of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm not sure to what extent loans and wage subsidies were implemented. Maybe, you might be a little more in tune with that because I was out of Trinidad during that period. But I'm sure that the government would have, or I'm hoping that the government at the time would have implemented policy measures to assist the aviation industry. One of the, because I am also one of the hats I wear is with the logistics and freight forwarding business, I must say that the shift to cargo was instrumental during the COVID period. And of course, the need to import face masks, sanitizers, PPE during COVID allowed some airlines to continue operating and keeping their aircraft active, the pilot, the crew current, right? They shifted to cargo. And I always maintain that Trinidad and Tobago has a lot to gain from cargo. One of my sore points, for example, is there seems to be a lack of communication between Trinidad and Canada. There's only one airline operating that bridge, Caribbean Airlines. I think WestJet and Air Canada are supposed to come back on stream, but I'm not sure when. The last few times they have changed. And I think more is needed in terms of government outreach and country-to-country participation. Because when we think of aviation, commercial aviation, we're not only thinking about passengers, we're thinking about cargo. And cargo implies the ability to increase our exports. And of course, we are no stranger to the foreign exchange woes that we have here. And cargo is definitely a way to go because air cargo facilitates the transportation of perishables, which surface cargo, marine cargo may have issues with, right? In terms of long-term implications for the pandemic, I think that certain changes have come about in a very short space of time during that pandemic because airlines, non-airline operators, integrated cargo, for example, multimodal providers, trucking companies, rail, shipping, all had to reassess their cost structures and invest in newer technologies, for example, green technologies. And it's not something that we have in our books in Trinidad, but I know in other countries they're talking about biofuels for aviation, right? Maybe that's something that we would see here in the near future as other countries begin to adapt to those things, sustainable fuels, for example. It's called SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuels. Maybe at some point we will begin to see that happening here as well, hopefully with some assistance from our government heads to get the airlines and the other players involved.
Great. Adil, as we get ready to wrap up, I guess I have a couple questions for you
Sure.
on a lighter note before we get ready to leave. So I want to know, what are your thoughts on the issues surrounding the Boeing 737 MAX?
Well, that's a very contentious area for me. I was trained in the systems of the MAX before the two accidents which led to its grounding sometime in the first quarter of 2019. What I can say is this. The 737 is a narrow-body aircraft that was designed in the late 50s and introduced in the 60s for short to medium haul routes. It was designed basically if you wanted to fly from Miami to maybe Washington, D.C., it could have handled that. With time and with pressures put on fuel costs and with increasing populations in general, they have maxed it out. Hence the term MAX 8, right? They maxed it out. However, and this is an engineering concept, right? There is actually it's a marketing concept. There's something called the product life cycle. Every product has a point where it begins to taper off, right? Meaning additional features, benefits, efficiency. You reach the period where it's a plateau. It's a flat curve. And I think the 737 800 series, 900 series, which is what Caribbean Airlines used up to quite recently when they retired those aircraft. I think that was the pinnacle for the 737 type of aircraft, right? So the 737 800, 900 series, that was the pinnacle of the type of the 737 type of aircraft. Boeing, in a competitive move to go head-to-head with its main competitor, Airbus, when they introduced the Airbus A321 Neo, it's called the Neo, they introduced the MAX as their market competitor. The issue is, the changes that they made to the MAX, one of the key changes was the engines, because they had to have engines of similar efficiency and range as the Neo. The problem is, the 737 by design is lower than the Airbus A320 series, right? If you sit as a passenger in both, you can tell it's quite apparent that the 737 is much lower. In order to accommodate an engine of a larger diameter for the air to come into the engine, they had to position the engine forward, and they didn't slightly increase the height. And that is where the issues started to arise. And I've spoken to pilots off the record who fly that aircraft type, the MAX 8, and they all expressed some level of concern because Boeing's solution was to use software to fix a physical engineering issue, right? And the aircraft now is heavily software oriented. It's called a full authority digital engine control system. The cockpit is redesigned, right, to reflect more glass type of digital displays. And I think that Boeing erred in its decision. What they should have done was stick a pin, maintain the series, the type of aircraft for a while to come, right? Because it has been around since the 60s, right? That's quite a long time for a product to stay in existence. But they should have probably looked at another type of aircraft that they already have and built on that. And my suggestion would have been the 757, which you hardly see these days. It is designed for medium to long routes, which is what Boeing had in mind when it introduced the MAX. But other than that, I'm sure that as other incidents occur, they will implement fixes, hopefully non-fatal incidents. They would implement fixes and checks. And I suppose it goes into an area called human factors and crew resource management. The whole human factor element of human beings interfacing with technology was overlooked when they trained pilots for the MAX. And like I said, I was in the training. And the training lasted less than 3 hours, right? When what should have been needed was a completely new type rating for pilots to operate the MAX. And I think that is where Boeing erred in this whole saga.
Lovely. Final question. What is your hypothesis concerning the Malaysian airline flight 5370 that would have disappeared in 2014? What is your hypothesis about what occurred?
That's not an easy hypothesis. That occurred about 10 years ago. I was teaching an airline dispatch class in Florida when that flight went down. And I've watched the videos. Back when it occurred, I studied it. My hypothesis is that the aircraft is somewhere in the bottom of the Indian Ocean, right? Based on the facts that were revealed, I mean, there have been many theories, many suspicions as to what occurred. My hunch is probably an act of unlawful interference, and that could have come from the crew as well, right? It could have been a human factors related issue. And currently, I'm teaching a crew resource management course with Algoma University in Canada. And human factors simply mean it could be a case of pilot incapacitation. If, for example, the aircraft air conditioning and pressurization system, there was an issue with that system, or there was an event of decompression. Obviously, aircraft fly at altitudes where we cannot breathe. So the cabin has to be pressurized. And on that type of aircraft, it would have been pressurized to an altitude of 8,000 feet, cabin altitude. If, for example, a hole or a door blew out, and we know Boeing is no stranger to that, it would have depressurized the aircraft. Now, an aircraft typically flies using a flight director or an autopilot system for navigation and maintenance of the altitude. It is typical once you take off, the pilots would have programmed the flight plan into the flight management computer before the flight. So once that aircraft takes off and you put on the automation, the aircraft flies itself. And the 777, which is the type of aircraft that was involved in the MH370, that is a very complex aircraft. Although it was designed in the 90s, it has a very sophisticated flight control system. Requires a flight crew of 2 pilots. And one possible theory is that they put the automation on and one or both of them would have been incapacitated and the aircraft flew itself until all the fuel ran out. That's one theory. The other theory could be that one of the pilots probably commandeered the aircraft, locked the other one out of the door. And post 9/11, aircraft doors have been virtually impenetrable, right? So once you lock it, tough luck getting in. And I think that was a theory they were looking at with the first officer or the co-pilot. Or it could have been a passenger. Passenger had overtaken the aircraft, disabled the communications. Remember, they didn't find the actual aircraft. They didn't find the box, what we call the flight data recorder or the cockpit voice recorder. They didn't find anything. Maybe sometime in the future they could locate that, but I'm dubious at this point whether they can make use of any data even if they were to recover said equipment, because sitting at the bottom of the ocean, it would have been susceptible to saltwater intrusion, corrosion, pressures at the bottom of the ocean. Remember that part of the ocean is very deep, so we don't even know how long that will last. But maybe in time new evidence emerges. At this point, these are teaching examples for airlines and also for companies allied to the airlines and for regulators, in particular insurance companies. Aircraft insurance is indeed something that is very nuanced. It's a specialized area of its own. And I am sure or confident that insurers are still paying for the losses of MH370.
Well, Adil, this has been a great and a fantastic conversation. I want to say thank you very much for stopping by, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, much obliged, Colin, and all the best in your endeavors with the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Legal Corner podcast series. For more information, please visit us at our Facebook or Instagram pages or send your comments to thelegalcornerpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.